Okay, well, I thought by way of a start, I would just say a few things by way of overview, really, across Britain as a whole. And I think it's worth thinking about Britain as an island, as it were, because it means we're not dealing with England, or for that matter, Scotland and Wales, as national units. We're dealing with buildings as part of the geography, really. And it's always been core to vernacular architecture to look at the regional variations and the local variations, and we can see those across Britain. There is quite ambitious theme for next year's conference to look at connections beyond the island of Britain, particularly to Europe and to North America. But today we're focusing on Britain, and we've got case studies from Nick Hill on medieval first floor halls and chambers, Duncan James on Wales and the borders, John Thorpe on Devon, David Cant on Yorkshire, and then Niall Logan on Scotland, and the urban dimension, which is obviously important for the contrast in room use, particularly storied buildings, I think, in urban contexts, quite different from the rural. And then finally, Nat is going to tell us about the new VAG databases that are under development. So I'm piggybacking on Giants. I've taken some slides from two articles that provided an overview of what was called in both these articles the British Isles, might more neutrally be called the Isles, which both still worth reading, actually. Obviously, a lot of the empirical evidence is a bit out of date. We know a lot more now sometimes about the distribution of different types of buildings than Arlen or Smith knew. But they're both really, really worth reading and accessible online. And for my purposes, have some useful slides. There was an excellent VAG conference to Ireland that Fred Arlen organised, gosh, about 20 years ago now, which some people will remember, and some people will remember Peter Smith, who I was lucky enough to meet on some of my first VAG spring conferences. So these slides are from Arlen's article, and I just wanted to make the point, which is that the house form we're most familiar with, which is the 3-unit house, which is rectilinear, usually only one room deep, and with a central room, a service end, and then an inner room end, that tripartite rectilinear house goes all the way back to the early medieval period and, in fact, the Roman period. I know there's a Roman farmhouse at Wing on the Wolds in East Yorkshire, which brilliantly demonstrates the 3-room plan that we're so familiar with a central room, very posh Roman parlour end with a plastered room, folding doors even, and then the cooking taking place at the service end in a 3rd room. So it's just worth bearing in mind that that's very deep roots for the variation on the 3-room plan that we see later on. Now, Arlen provides a series of plan types, which mainly relate to the different ways in which hearths and chimneys are inserted into the traditional open floor. So many people would be very familiar with this, the hearth passage plan, where the hearth and the stack is placed against the cross passage, or plan where the hearth is placed away from the cross passage and may well heat the parlour end as well as the hall space. And the point I want to make really is just to ask the question whether these variations in plan form, and particularly the location of the chimney, have implications for the way in which rooms are used, or the way in which the house is used, and people move or conduct tasks or enjoy themselves when they're relaxing. Whether these sorts of differences in room plan have an effect on room use or not It might be that this is a product of the way craftsmen want to do it in different areas, and the way in which people live in these houses is actually broadly similar, but it's an interesting question. And then Arlen makes the point in these slides about the variation by the late medieval and post-medieval periods in terms of whether people are living in storied houses or whether people are living in ground floor, single story houses with perhaps lofts for some sleeping and storage. And there is this very marked phenomena by the 18th and 19th centuries of single storied housing in Northumberland and Cumbria and further north, as well as in West Wales and Ireland, whereas the storied houses are more predominant, though not absent in those areas, more predominant in southern and eastern England. Now that has a great deal to do with wealth, but it also has something to do with culture and the differences in why some people retain ground floor living tradition and some people prefer to go upstairs. Okay, another slide from Arlen, which really makes the point which many of us will be very familiar with, which is that types of rural housing often grow out of a longhouse tradition, particularly where rebuilding has taken place in particular settlements, and the medieval housing has been replaced in later centuries, rebuilding the longhouse form. And that again may have implications for room use in terms of the form of the building and how the rooms are arranged and used. There's also the question of lateral stacks, and rather than placing the chimney to either end of the hall, it's to the side of the hall, and whether or not that has a relationship to the way in which the hall is being used as a room. Moving on, again, these maps are quite dated now in terms of evidence for distribution. I think we have evidence for lobby entry houses now, certainly right the way across England. I was delighted to find one in Durham about 20 years ago, very heavily modernised, but there is a lobby entry example at North End in Durham. Anyhow, this lobby entry form where the entrance is against the chimney stack with a parlour to one side and main hall, living room and service end to the other side, that very obviously relates to room use, and particularly the division between entering the parlour or entering the everyday working world, really, of the hall and service end. Okay, so just to summarise, really, it's worth bearing in mind, I think, that rectilinear houses in Britain, certainly in England, relate all the way back to Roman times, and that we have a tripartite pattern which is fixed over very, very many generations. Before 17th, 18th centuries, most houses tend to be one room deep in linear ranges, and that may well relate in part to the climate and damp, and particularly being able to ventilate buildings by being only one room deep. This tripartite division of a central room, an inner room and a service end persists through the medieval period and on into what we call the early modern period, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It also, if you think about it, continues in later 19th and 20th century terraced housing. There's often a best room at the front, an everyday room in the middle, and the services to the rear of the house. And this is standard, interestingly, across urban and rural contexts. And I think this sort of standard of house then varies according to wealth. So poorer households are often restricted in terms of their rooms, and they may lack a parlour. They may lack an inner room at all, and they may be reduced to just one living room, a sleeping space, and a storage space. Very rarely, in my experience, entirely a single room. There usually is still some spatial division for sleeping and storage. Wealthier households, of course, can elaborate the 3-room plan endlessly. Services can become incredibly elaborate, as indeed can upper ends, parlours and chambers can develop into a whole suite of specialist rooms, whether that's chapels or libraries or galleries or what have you. One thing I wanted to point out is that there is evidence Chris King has found for Norwich in his excellent book on houses and society in Norwich, that he's got evidence for households in Norwich without a hall, relatively modest households in the 15th, 16th centuries where there is no evidence for a hall in the house. So that might shake up some of our assumptions that medieval, post-medieval houses in England are always anchored around a hall. Okay, just to make some very broad points, some very obvious points really, but if we're going to think about room use, we have to think about furnishings, and ideally through documentary evidence. And Nat Alcott's book, People at Home, is excellent at linking probate inventories to surviving buildings, and Pat Hughes's fantastic reconstruction drawings that really animate the house and show the houses with people at home doing their everyday tasks and showing the likely arrangement of the rooms. As well as probate inventories, which people are probably very familiar with, there are also pauper inventories. A great deal of these survive for East Anglia and occasionally in record offices in other counties. And there are very good studies of Essex and Norfolk if people are interested in this. Another great resource for room use actually is the hearth tax from the 1660s, 1670s, which can tell us the number of heated rooms in a house. And that can often be a very firm guide to the likely room use. Incidentally, there's a new volume in that series coming out on Norfolk and Norwich this year. And last year's Winter VAG focused on the hearth tax, and the recordings from that conference are on the VAG YouTube channel. And in fact, today's recordings will also go on YouTube. Right, as well as showing other people's slides, I thought I'd better show some of my own work. So this is an analysis I did of what, broadly speaking, I'm calling pauper inventories with room names. Pauper inventories are the record of household goods owned by the parish. They were either loaned out to pensioners, older people too old or infirm to work, who the parishes in Norfolk particularly, or Essex, were providing with furnishings. And some of these inventories, when they list the goods, basically when they're being taken back into the parishes.
Right. All right.
Sometimes these inventories give room names. Not all of these inventories, however, are for parish paupers who are receiving a pension from the parish. Some of these inventories are also for people who've got into debt and their household goods are being taken by the parish because they've got into debt. So their goods are forfeit. And some of the more elaborate households here with a greater number of rooms may well be debtors rather than paupers, though I haven't distinguished that on this slide. But they certainly give us an insight into room use by the 18th century. And as many people will be familiar, for East Anglia particularly, poorer people have a main room, which is really the hall that is called the kitchen by the 18th century. And they usually have a sleeping room, a chamber, which may be dignified with the term parlour, that may contain some better furnishings. Anyhow, I recommend those as a source if people aren't already familiar. And Adam Longcroft's excellent article in VA 2002 collects together examples of smaller houses in Norfolk where he shows the entrance position and the hearth, but also, if you notice, storage in each of these households. And I think that is significant, that room use, even in very restricted spaces, still involves very particular use of space and subdivision of space. Also, actually, very flexible use of space. And this is a somewhat more affluent example of housing in Norfolk, the Rows in Yarmouth, which are built in the late, or rebuilt in the late 17th century. They have the provision of a stair next to the entrance, which means that these houses can be subdivided into flats, as it were. There could be a separate household potentially on the first floor. Better off households in these houses will occupy the full house, even with a closet window. Closets, of course, can be more than storage. They can be about prayer traditionally, or reading. But the point I wanted to make actually is the fact that the late 17th century particularly has a lot of folding furniture, a lot of gate leg tables and other sorts of basic furniture elements that can be moved to one side and put away. And it seems to me that that is telling us something about the flexible use of space and the need sometimes to be able to clear the floor for other purposes, whether that's for spinning, other tasks, or indeed high days and holidays when you might want to use the floor space for something else. Okay, this has come out rather fuzzy, having taken it from a source online, but this is an excellent cutaway reconstruction of a typical London house from the Museum of the Home in London. And I just wanted to use this to make a couple of points. One is the privy out back. We don't always think enough about those aspects of life when we're just looking at the main rooms in a building, the outbuildings, and particularly privy arrangements. Use of upper floors in towns, and the question of how the use of upper stories might compare across different towns. Thinking particularly of the major towns, how would London, Edinburgh, Norwich, Newcastle, York, Bristol, and so forth, how would storied houses in all those places compare if we were actually to do that sort of analysis? Sarah Pennell has written a terrific book on the English kitchen, which for one thing points out that basement kitchens in London, partly because of having a standing water tap and needing that to be gravity fed in the 17th century. I hadn't realised till I read Sarah's book that that was one of the origins for basement kitchens in London, was gravity fed water supply. And there was more piped water in 17th century England than we might ever imagine, really. And Sarah's book is also really terrific on the way in which the kitchen is experienced by different people in the household. So the mistress may occasionally appear, or may indeed get involved with the cooking. Servants of different sorts have a different experience of the kitchen, and Sarah shows how the kitchen can be very much their own world in the evening. Lodgers may have a separate right to use the kitchen to prepare their own food, and people making deliveries to the house may come into the kitchen and be part of the world of the kitchen, though they might not ever experience the rest of the house. So particularly for more affluent establishments, the way in which different members of the household or different people coming into the house experience rooms, I think is worth thinking about, and particularly the kind of multi-dimensional way in which rooms are used and experienced. Now, this is the famous Doll's House at what's now a National Trust property, Nostell Priory, between Wakefield and Pontefract. And it's one of the earlier surviving dolls' houses, or baby houses as they were called, in the 18th century. And I appreciate this is a grand gentry house, not particularly vernacular perhaps, but I just wanted to point out really the experience of women, and particularly what earlier experiences as children or young women might bring to a woman establishing a household or running a household as a married woman. And it's interesting that the hall, the staircase hall in this doll's house is uncannily similar to a staircase hall, which is actually even older, it's about 1700, in a house called Boynton Hall in East Yorkshire, where the woman who would have experienced this doll's house as a young woman, this was her married home when she'd married Letitia Wynne of Nostell, and married Sir George Strickland in 1751. So it's just interesting to think about how women bring their earlier experiences to their married home, particularly given the fact that women aren't usually directly involved in building. So, there's a lot of variation perhaps in how far a married woman might have a say in the form of a house being rebuilt or remodeled. And just to conclude almost, this house here from Arlen's slide is very similar to the house my grandmother and grandfather lived in West Wales, just here. And I mention it in this context because it's a standard house of about 1800, built for a large estate, which became farms that were sold off in the 20th century. And it looks like a standard tenanted Georgian farmhouse, but the way my grandmother lived in it carried over really the way she was brought up, in a house with a parlour at the front, a middle room and a kitchen at the back. And this kitchen at the rear, main living room for eating, sitting, and then a room that was in some ways the best room and never used, the parlour, but also a room that was very flexible. It's where older members of the family were cared for when they were close to death. It's where children played. It's where my mother did her homework. And yet in other ways, it's where my grandmother stored the fruit and the butter. But in other ways, it was really a treasure room that was never actually used for sitting in, despite my grandfather's protestations that they might put the television in there. Anyway, I'm not saying this just to reminisce. I'm saying it because if I didn't know that from my knowledge of how the house was used, it'd be very difficult to tell from looking at the building itself that that is exactly how it was used. And that's one of the frustrations perhaps of looking at buildings, is that it can be quite difficult to tell how rooms were used by particular generations in very particular ways. Okay, finally, we might come back to some of this at the end, but the very broad questions around room use, I think, particularly looking at buildings in Britain, is first of all, why go upstairs at all? Why do we have storied buildings of different kinds in different periods? And indeed, why continue to live downstairs on the ground floor? There may be economic reasons for that, but there may also be cultural reasons for that. And obviously, in terms of thinking about the household, there's the issue of male and female experiences of the house, but also the experiences of rooms by different members of the household, subordinate members of the household, children, youths, the old, and servants, as well as the main master or mistress. And that those different members of the household will have their own use of these rooms, probably. So to state the obvious, rooms of sleeping, eating, working, prayer, storage, sex, sitting, reading. They're used for holidays and holidays as well as every day. Childbirth, illness. I think fireplaces in chambers are often perhaps only lit when people are ill or lying in. And of course, the funeral in the house. That's can be an important way in which the house is used, and memories are carried over from one generation to another. Work, of course, which may not just be within the house, it can be in the outbuildings as well. And then this whole question really of social relations, the family and the servants, but also relations to people outside the house. And what sometimes gets talked about in terms of privacy is often, I think, about changes in those relationships between people within the household of different status, or changes in relationship between how people in the house want to relate to people coming into the house. For example, the lobby entry dividing direct entry into the parlour from entry into the hall, or basement services and back stairs, what they tell us about different members of the household using the house. And of course, there's regional variation, often relating to work and the economy in different occupations. And the rather frustrating question, I think, for us, when we're looking at buildings, because we tend to look at buildings in terms of how they were changed as buildings, but are people in buildings of different periods, older houses alongside new builds, are they actually using rooms in similar ways in any given generation, whether they're in an old house or a new house? And it may not be obvious from standing buildings how rooms were used exactly, which is why, if we can, probate in pauper inventories, the hearth tax and other sorts of records.
70 or more around.
Okay, that's the broad points I wanted to start off with. So we're now up to 10 o'clock and we can move on to the main papers. So